June 19, 1944. Somewhere over the Philippine Sea, roughly 120 miles west of the Mariana Islands. The air smelled of avgas and salt and something electric, the way the sky smells just before violence. Lieutenant Alexander Vrashew was already climbing, his F6F Hellcat clawing for altitude, the engine hammering in his chest at 2,000 horsepower. Below him, the fleet stretched to every horizon: 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, 6 to 9 destroyers. The largest naval force the United States had ever assembled, spread across an ocean that had been, not 3 years before, a Japanese lake. Vrashew banked his aircraft and squinted west into the morning haze. His radio crackled with voices, some tight, some urgent, some eerily controlled. Fighter directors aboard the carriers were calling out vectors and altitudes. Bogies. Dozens of them. And then the count started coming in, and even the controlled voices changed slightly in register. Not dozens. Not 100. Something approaching 430 Japanese aircraft launched in 3 coordinated waves from 9 fleet carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy's mobile fleet. The largest carrier-based airstrike in the history of naval warfare, descending on the American fleet like a wall. If this is your first time here, take a second and subscribe before we go any further. What happened in the next 6 hours rewrote the rules of naval air power forever, and most people have never heard the full story told the way it deserves to be told. The Japanese admiral commanding that armada, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, believed with genuine conviction that he was sending his pilots into a battle they could win. He had reasons for that belief, logical ones, grounded in doctrine and experience and a careful reading of Japanese naval history. He was about to be proved catastrophically wrong. But to understand the scale of that error, and why the men in those aircraft paid for it the way they did, you have to go back further. Back to a time when the Zero was not a target. When it was a terror. December 1941. The Mitsubishi A6M0, officially the Navy Type Zero carrier fighter, was the most capable shipboard aircraft in the world, and the men who flew it were among the most lethal aviators alive. The Zero had earned that reputation not by accident but through sustained combat over China, where Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service pilots had developed something their counterparts in the American, British, and Dutch air services simply did not yet possess: genuine, sustained, carrier-based combat experience at scale. By the time Japan struck Pearl Harbor, the frontline pilot cadre of the IJNAF had logged thousands of hours in the Zero, had developed precise gunnery instincts at deflection angles that took Western pilots years to acquire, and had refined the specific geometry of aerial combat through real engagements, not simulated ones. The aircraft matched its pilots. The Zero weighed just over 5,800 pounds at combat weight, making it extraordinarily maneuverable. Its Nakajima Seiki 14-cylinder radial engine produced 1,020 horsepower, enough to push it to speeds above 330 miles per hour in level flight and give it a climb rate that stunned American pilots encountering it for the first time. Its range was exceptional for a carrier aircraft, over 1,600 miles with a drop tank. It could outturn, outclimb, and outrange virtually everything the Allies flew in 1941, and it did so with a kind of balletic precision that the men flying Brewster Buffaloes and early model Wildcats found immediately lethal. The lessons were paid in blood. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, American F4F Wildcats survived engagements with Zeros largely through a specific defensive maneuver, the Thatch Weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, a scissors pattern in which 2 fighters covered each other's tails and denied the Zero the free pursuit angle it needed. You could not outfly a Zero in 1942. The sum of American tactical wisdom in the early war was essentially, do not let it get behind you. That inheritance shaped how an entire generation of naval aviators approached the Pacific Air War. And then, slowly, industrially, the calculus began to shift. The United States had decided, with the full institutional weight of its mobilized economy, to build a new fighter. Not a refinement of the Wildcat. Something purpose-built. And the philosophy behind the new aircraft was different from the ground up. Where the Zero had been designed around lightness, range, and maneuverability, the new American fighter was designed around something else entirely: the ability to kill and to survive being shot at. The Grumman F6F Hellcat entered fleet service in the late summer of 1943. It was, on paper, not graceful. It weighed over 12,000 pounds fully loaded, roughly double the Zero's combat weight. It was powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. It was armored. It carried 6 50-caliber machine guns in its wings. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing. A Zero pilot who put cannon rounds into a Hellcat's engine compartment might watch his tracers disappear into steel firewall and armor plate without result. A Hellcat pilot who put 50-caliber rounds into a Zero's unprotected fuel system watched it burn. Grumman built aircraft the way a good tool manufacturer builds a wrench. Not for aesthetics but for function, for reliability, for the ability to take abuse and keep working. The company had long been known as the Grumman Iron Works among naval aviators, and they meant it as the highest compliment. Here was a machine you could bring home half-broken. Here was a machine engineered to be repaired at sea by exhausted deck crews, to absorb combat damage and still fly, to forgive mistakes that a less robust airframe would punish with fire and a plunge into the ocean. The Hellcat was not the best-performing fighter at any single performance metric. At 2,000 horsepower, it was not the fastest American fighter in the sky in 1944. But it was the fighter that fit the Pacific War, the vast distances, the sustained combat tempo, the need to put inexperienced pilots into combat situations and bring a workable percentage of them home. Because that was the other half of the equation, and it was the half Azawa had not properly calculated. The Zero's greatest advantage in 1941 had been its pilots. By 1944, those pilots, or rather, the absence of them, had become the Zero's greatest liability. Japan had entered the war with approximately 3,500 highly skilled naval aviators, the product of a years-long selection and training system that was rigorous, effective, and designed for a small professional force, not for a sustained attrition war. The Japanese training pipeline could produce exceptional pilots. It could not produce them quickly. It had never been asked to. Midway, in June 1942, cost Japan over 100 of its most experienced carrier aviators in a single engagement. The Solomons Campaign, the grinding, months-long air war over Guadalcanal and the surrounding island chain through the latter half of 42 and all of 43, consumed Japanese naval air power at a rate that defied replenishment. The Americans brought fresh squadrons in rotation. The Japanese fed their best men into the fight and watched them not come back. Admiral Yamamoto's own air offensive in April 1943, Operation Igo, was described afterward in Japanese after-action reports as a tremendous success based on inflated overclaiming. In reality, it had cost Japan over 100 more aircraft and experienced aircrew it could not replace, in exchange for marginal damage to American shipping. By early 1944, the carrier aviation squadrons of the mobile fleet were being rebuilt around pilots who were, by the honest reckoning of their own senior officers, undertrained. Some had logged fewer than 250 flying hours total before assignment to fleet units. The average in many units was not much higher. In pre-war Japan, a naval aviator might accumulate 800 to 1,000 hours before being considered combat-ready. The pipeline no longer had time for that standard. It no longer had the fuel, in many cases, for that standard. Japan's petroleum situation was already becoming critical by mid-1944, and training flights burned fuel that was needed elsewhere. Their American counterparts had no such constraint. The United States had industrialized pilot training the same way it had industrialized aircraft production and carrier construction. Methodically, at scale, without cutting corners on the output even when it meant cutting time on individual steps. Flight cadets flowed through primary training on biplanes at civilian fields, then basic training on more powerful aircraft, then advanced training on the combat type they would fly, then a tour through an operational training unit where they flew against instructors who had already been to the Pacific and come back. By the time a Hellcat pilot joined a fleet squadron in 1944, he typically carried between 500 and 800 hours in his logbook, with specific instruction in gunnery, navigation, carrier landing, section tactics, and the particular vulnerabilities of the aircraft he would be fighting. He had been taught, in detail, not to follow a Zero in a turning fight at low speed. He had been taught where the Zero's fuel tanks were, how quickly it burned, why you went vertical when it tried to turn with you. Knowledge like that, drilled into pilots at training fields in Pensacola and Corpus Christi, was worth altitude and airspeed over the Philippine Sea. And then there was the radar, and the system built around it. By June 19, 1944, every major American fleet carrier in Task Force 58, Vice Admiral Mark Mitch's Fast Carrier Task Force, the concentrated striking arm of American naval power in the Pacific, was equipped with air search radar capable of detecting incoming aircraft at ranges up to 80 miles. These radar sets reported to fighter direction officers aboard each carrier, specialists trained in the interception problem, who tracked incoming formations on plotting boards and assigned intercept vectors to combat air patrol fighters by radio. The system had been tested and refined across 2 years of Pacific combat. It was not perfect, but it was fast, it was integrated across the task groups, and it gave the Americans something the Japanese strike pilots could never recover from: time. Time to climb. Time to reach altitude and airspeed before the Japanese formations arrived. Time for the fighter direction officer to put 200 Hellcats precisely where they needed to be, at the right altitude, with energy advantage over aircraft that had flown 100 miles already and were beginning to descend into their attack profiles. Ozawa knew, in a general sense, that the Americans had radar. What he appears not to have fully understood, what no Japanese operational planning document from this period demonstrates clear awareness of, was the degree to which American fighter direction had transformed the radar contact into a tactical weapon. The British had developed the rudiments of this system in the Battle of Britain in 1940. The Americans had refined it, extended it, and built it into every carrier task group operation. Ozawa was not simply sending his pilots against a fleet. He was sending them against a fleet that would know they were coming 4 to 5 minutes before they arrived. He had a second miscalculation, larger in some ways than the first. Ozawa's battle plan rested on what he and his staff called the outranging concept. The mobile fleet would operate at a range of approximately 350 miles from the American carriers, beyond the practical combat radius of American strike aircraft, which meant the Americans could not reach him with their own attacks while his aircraft, with their superior range, flew the full distance, struck the fleet, and then, if needed, diverted to the captured airfields on Guam, Tinian, and Rota in the Marianas to refuel and rearm before returning to the carriers. The Japanese carrier aircraft would, in this formulation, be able to use the island bases as a relay point, effectively extending their operational reach in a way American aircraft could not match. What Ozawa did not know, as he launched his first wave in the pre-dawn hours of June 19, was that the island airfields he was counting on no longer existed as operational entities. In the days leading up to the battle, Admiral Mitcher had directed sustained carrier strikes against every airfield in the Marianas. American Hellcats and dive bombers had swept the islands repeatedly, destroying Japanese aircraft on the ground and in the air, cratering runways, destroying fuel and ammunition stores. The land-based air power that Ozawa had factored into his calculation as a significant multiplier, perhaps 130 to 150 additional aircraft, had been systematically hunted down. The survivors were scattered, disorganized, and in many cases grounded for lack of serviceable aircraft. Communications between Ozawa's fleet and the shore bases were poor, and what information did get through was incomplete. Ozawa launched his attack believing he had a strategic asset. He did not. He had launched 430 aircraft into a battle whose premise no longer held. Vraishu was at altitude when the first Japanese formations came into sight, dark specks against the blue, growing steadily, resolving into shapes. The fighter direction aboard the carriers had been tracking the incoming waves for nearly an hour. The Hellcat pilots had been climbing since the first radar contacts appeared on the plotting boards, positioned by radio to intercept at altitude with speed advantage already built in. This was not going to be a fair fight in the sense of equal opportunity. It was going to be a collision between two different versions of what air warfare had become, and only one of those versions had been designed for this specific moment. In the cockpit, there was no time for reflection. There was the gun sight and the throttle and the decision about which aircraft to take first, and then the violence of it, sudden and total, the sky full of burning things. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know we don't just cover the battles, we cover the human stories behind them. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next, because the story of what happened above that fleet in the next 6 hours is unlike anything else in the history of naval aviation. The first Japanese wave, designated Raid 1 by American fighter directors, consisted of 6 to 9 aircraft launched from Ozawa's light carriers. They were detected on radar at approximately 9:45 in the morning, while still well over 100 miles from the American fleet. The fighter direction team aboard the carrier Lexington, operating as the task force flagship, had already positioned a substantial combat air patrol to meet them. By the time Raid 1's pilots could see the silhouettes of American carriers on the horizon, they were already being engaged. What the Japanese pilots encountered was not what their briefings had prepared them for. The Hellcats came down from above, from altitude, with speed, attacking in coordinated sections rather than as individuals. The defensive tactics the American pilots had been taught specifically addressed the Zero's advantages. Do not turn with it at low speed, use the Hellcat's power to go vertical, use the 650 calibers in coordinated firing passes, maintain section integrity. The Zero pilots, for their part, had been trained to a standard that predated the current situation. Many of them had never been in actual combat. They were flying by doctrine against an enemy who had spent 2 years learning how that doctrine worked and developing specific counters. The results of Raid 1 were immediate and severe. Of the 69 aircraft in the first wave, 16 reached the vicinity of the American fleet. 42 were shot down. The survivors who got through achieved very little. A bomb hit on the battleship South Dakota, minor damage to other vessels. The losses were not acceptable by any measure of air warfare. Raid 2, the largest of the day, was already in the air when the remnants of Raid 1 were still being chased down. 128 aircraft had been launched from Azoa's heavy carriers, his best aircraft, his most capable units. This was the strike Azoa believed would be decisive. The fighter directors tracking Raid 2 on radar vectored every available Hellcat in the region to intercept. What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a systematic destruction. American pilots later described the engagement with a kind of stunned brevity that said more than any elaborate account could. The Japanese formations did not maneuver effectively as units. Individual pilots showed courage. There is no question of that. Men flying alone into a cloud of Hellcats required a specific kind of courage, but the unit coordination that transforms individual courage into tactical effectiveness was absent. Aircraft broke formation. Sections came apart. The mutual support that makes a fighter formation survivable against a coordinated attack simply did not materialize in the way it needed to. Of the 128 aircraft in Raid 2, approximately 97 were shot down. Nearly all of them before they reached the American fleet. Vraishu accounted for 6 Japanese aircraft in approximately 8 minutes. He came back aboard the Lexington, climbed out of his cockpit, and held up 6 fingers to the waiting deck crew and the admiral watching from the island. 6 confirmed kills in a single sortie. The image was photographed and would become one of the most recognized images of the Pacific Air War. But Vraishu was not an anomaly on June 19th. He was simply the most dramatic example of a pattern that was repeating itself across the entire engagement. American pilots were recording multiple kills in single sorties because the Japanese formations were arriving already degraded, already broken up by radar-directed interceptions, the survivors entering combat without altitude, without airspeed, and in many cases without section partners. Raids 3 and 4, launched later in the day from Azoa's remaining carriers, fared no better. Raid 3, 4 to 7 aircraft, lost approximately 7 of its planes before ever reaching the fleet and then was largely broken up by combat air patrol. Raid 4, 82 aircraft including a substantial force from the carriers Junyo and Hayo, lost most of its planes to Hellcats and anti-aircraft fire, and the survivors who reached Guam looking for the airfields Azoa had promised found runways under American fighter attack and aircraft already burning on the aprons. By the end of June 19th, the Imperial Japanese Navy's mobile fleet had lost approximately 243 aircraft and their crews. The Americans lost 23 aircraft in air combat, with others lost to operational accidents. The ratio was not a margin, it was an erasure. The fighter pilots back aboard their carriers that evening were exhausted and, in many cases, still processing what had happened. The scale of what they had just participated in was not yet clear to most of them. They had been too busy, too focused on the individual mechanics of the engagements, the gun sight, the throttle, the target in front of them, to step back and perceive the larger shape of the day. That perception would come later, when the kill claims were compiled and compared against the radar tracks and the surviving Japanese pilot reports, when the numbers were added up and the ratio became visible. The sailors and officers aboard the American ships had their own perspective on the day. They had watched their radar screens and their radio networks track wave after wave of Japanese aircraft. They had watched the interceptions develop, the dotted lines on the plotting boards converging, the radio voices calling kills, the smaller contacts that had been Japanese formations disappearing from the boards. They had been under attack, technically, all day. Very few of the attacking aircraft had gotten through to them. Anti-aircraft gunners had seen action. A handful of ships had been hit or near-missed. But the fleet itself, the carriers, the battleships, the destroyers, was intact. Someone, on someone's ship, called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name stuck, passed from ship to ship through the informal communications network of the fleet, arriving in official correspondence and eventually in newspaper accounts. It was a name born of relief and the particular dark humor of men who have spent a day waiting to be killed and have instead watched their opponents die. It was also, in its levity, slightly misleading about what had actually happened, because what had happened was not luck, and it was not simply the product of superior equipment, and it was not adequately captured by any metaphor involving game birds. What had happened was the convergence of 3 years of American preparation with 3 years of Japanese attrition, meeting in a single day above an ocean neither country had cared about in 1938. The men who had built the Hellcat in the Grumman factory on Long Island had contributed to it. The instructors at Pensacola and Corpus Christi who had trained the pilots had contributed to it. The radar engineers who had designed and improved the SK and CXAM sets had contributed to it. The fighter direction officers who had spent months developing interception doctrine had contributed to it. The workers in the factories that had produced the 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney engines had contributed to it. The supply officers who had ensured that every carrier in Task Force 58 had sufficient aviation fuel, ammunition, and spare parts for sustained operations had contributed to it. On the Japanese side, the men who had died in the air over Guadalcanal in 1942 and 43 had contributed to it, in the sense that their deaths had depleted a training system that could not rebuild quickly enough. The fuel shortages that had shortened training flights in Japan through late 1943 and early 44 had contributed to it. The strategic decisions that had led to the attrition of experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced had contributed to it. June 19, 1944, was not a day that happened. It was a day that had been built, piece by piece, decision by decision, on both sides, across 3 years of war. But the day was not over. While the air battle had been raging, something else had been happening beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea that would change the balance of the engagement in ways the aerial score alone did not capture. American submarines had been tracking the Japanese fleet since its departure from Tori Tori in the Philippine archipelago. The USS Albacore and USS Cavala, operating independently, had both located elements of a Zouas mobile fleet. On the morning of June 19, while the first Japanese air raids were already in the air heading east, the Albacore found a Zouas flagship, the fleet carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and largest carrier, commissioned only in March of 1944, displacing 37,000 tons and considered the most capable carrier in the Japanese fleet. The Albacore fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. One struck the Taiho in the forward aircraft elevator area. The hit was not immediately catastrophic. The Taiho was large, compartmentalized, and her damage control teams responded quickly. Azawa continued to direct the battle from her bridge. But the torpedo had ruptured aviation fuel lines and fuel tanks deep in the ship, and fumes began to accumulate in the confined spaces of the lower decks. A damage control officer made the decision to ventilate the compartments by opening vents throughout the ship. The fumes spread rather than dispersed. Several hours after the torpedo hit, an accumulation of avgas vapor ignited somewhere in the ship's interior. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The Taiho, pride of the Japanese carrier fleet, sank within hours. Azawa was evacuated to a destroyer. Earlier that same morning, the Cavala had found the carrier Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, of the Coral Sea, of the Eastern Solomons and the Santa Cruz Islands, one of the last of Japan's original fleet carriers still operating. 3 torpedo hits proved fatal. The Shokaku, too, sank, taking hundreds of her crew and her remaining aircraft with her. 2 fleet carriers lost to submarines on the same day that the air battle was destroying Japan's carrier aviation. The mobile fleet, which had sortied with 9 carriers, ended June 19 with 7, and of those 7, several had lost the majority of their aircraft and many of their aircrew. The reserve of trained pilots that Japan had been building toward this battle, the accumulated aviation strength that was supposed to blunt American momentum in the Pacific, had been largely consumed in 6 hours. Ozawa did not yet know the full extent of what had happened. In the evening of June 19, as the surviving aircraft returned to his remaining carriers, and some of them did not return at all, some landed on Guam or Rota or simply ran out of fuel over the Philippine Sea, the numbers began to come in. Of the 430 aircraft launched that day, fewer than 130 had survived. The numbers from the search reports would be revised further downward in the days that followed. He decided to withdraw, not immediately. There was still the question of whether to seek a night engagement, whether to contest the battle further, but the fundamental decision had been made. The mobile fleet was no longer capable of offensive action. Whatever Ozawa had hoped to accomplish when he had sorted from Toritori, it was not going to happen. The Americans were not finished. The following day, June 20th, Admiral Micha launched a strike at extreme range against the retreating Japanese fleet. A decision of calculated risk, because the aircraft would be returning to the carriers in darkness, in fuel states close to empty, and Micha knew that some would not make it back. He ordered the fleet to turn on its lights to guide his pilots home, a decision that exposed the carriers to submarine and any remaining Japanese air threat. The strike found Ozawa's fleet and sank the carrier Hayo, damaged 2 additional carriers and 2 oilers, and shot down an additional 6 to 5 Japanese aircraft. The return flight in darkness cost the Americans 80 aircraft and 4 to 9 airmen lost, not to Japanese action but to fuel exhaustion and carrier landings gone wrong in the dark. The numbers from the 2-day battle, compiled afterward, Japan had lost approximately 476 aircraft across the 2 days, including the 3 carriers and several hundred aviators. The Americans had lost 130 aircraft, including the operational losses on the night of June 20th, and 76 men. The ratio of aircraft lost was roughly 3 to 1. The ratio of experienced, irreplaceable naval aviators was immeasurably higher in Japan's favor meaning loss. In Tokyo, the battle was reported to the Japanese public under a framework of qualified success, the terminology used to describe a devastating defeat without quite admitting it. The phrase used in official communiques acknowledged losses while asserting significant damage inflicted on the enemy, a formulation that the Japanese public had learned to read with a certain weariness by mid-1944. By this point in the war, official Japanese communiques about naval engagements had been announcing victories of one kind or another for 2.5 years while the perimeter shrank and the island garrisons stopped receiving supplies and the men who went to the Pacific stopped coming home. The American press had no such constraint. The Turkey Shoot entered American newspapers within days, the kill ratios cited with a specificity that seemed almost too large to be true. Congressional delegations visited the fleet. The pilots were interviewed, photographed, celebrated. Vrashu, with his 6 kills on June 19 and his accumulated total of 19 confirmed aerial victories by the end of his Pacific tour, became one of the celebrated names of naval aviation, his image with those 6 fingers raised on the Lexington's flight deck appearing in newspapers and eventually in history books. But the pilots themselves, the men who had done the shooting, tended to describe the experience with less celebration than the newspapers brought to it. They had been in it, had seen the individual faces of the thing, the Japanese aircraft coming apart under their guns, the oil streaks and the fires and the parachutes, the occasional Japanese pilot who maneuvered well and forced a second or third pass. They had seen the courage of individual men in aircraft that were outmatched by doctrine and equipment and the invisible disadvantage of everything that had happened in the 3 years before they climbed into their cockpits on June 19. There was something uncomfortable in the magnitude of the disparity, even in the moment of its occurrence. Commander David McCampbell, the Hellcat pilot who would finish the war as the Navy's leading ace with 34 confirmed kills, flew on June 19 and described the experience in terms that suggested not triumph but something closer to professional assessment. The Japanese formations had not been tactically coherent, the individual pilots had been brave but inexperienced. The combination of radar direction and Hellcat performance had made the interceptions systematic rather than chaotic. He did not use the word easy. He understood too well what flying into 300 Hellcats felt like from the inside to use that word. What the Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed was not simply a fleet and its aircraft. What it destroyed was Japan's last realistic possibility of contesting American naval supremacy in the Western Pacific through conventional carrier aviation. After June 19 and 20, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy would never again be able to assemble a carrier striking force capable of meeting the Americans on equal terms. The carriers that remained were largely intact as hulls but were operationally hollow, ships without adequate aircraft, without trained pilots to fly them, without the months of preparation that would have been needed to rebuild the air groups to combat effectiveness. Japan would adapt, as it had throughout the war, finding solutions within its constraints. The kamikaze program, the deliberate use of aircraft as guided weapons rather than as conventional fighters or bombers, was in part a response to exactly this reality, that conventionally trained naval aviators were no longer available in sufficient numbers to contest American air power on traditional terms. A pilot who needed only to guide his aircraft into a target, rather than to press an attack, disengage, return to the carrier, and fight again tomorrow, required far less training time than a conventional combat aviator. It was a terrible accommodation to a terrible strategic situation, and its origins lay in the debris field of June 19. Vrashu landed aboard the Lexington in the late afternoon of June 19. He had been airborne for a little over 2 hours. He had fired his guns for approximately 40 seconds total across all 6 of his kills. He estimated later that he had used roughly about 2 rounds per foot of wingspan on each target, a standard deflection shooting technique that his instructors had drilled into him in training. 6 aircraft destroyed, roughly 40 seconds of actual gunfire, inside a battle that had lasted most of a day and consumed hundreds of men on both sides. He held up those 6 fingers on the flight deck, squinting into the afternoon Pacific light, and a photographer got the shot. Later he would say, honestly, that he had been doing his job. That is what the training was for. That is what the Hellcat was built for. That is what the radar and the fighter direction and the fuel supply and the carrier construction program and every other component of the American war machine had been aimed at producing. This moment, this outcome, this ratio. The men who had built and flown and directed and supplied that force had done their work. On June 19, 1944, above a stretch of ocean west of the Mariana Islands, the work was proven. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot lasted 1 day. The preparation for it lasted 3 years. The consequences of it lasted until August 1945. And the lesson it contained, about what air power actually required, about the relationship between industrial capacity and tactical outcome, about the difference between courage and capability, echoed long past the end of the war it helped to conclude. If this story reached you, the radar plots, the kill ratios, the men on both sides of those gun sites, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who thinks they know everything about the Pacific War. There is always more story beneath the numbers, and we will keep finding it. Vrashu was asked, years after the war, what he remembered most clearly about June 19. He said he remembered the sky being very full, and then less full, and then the flight home with nearly empty tanks and the deck of the Lexington rising to meet him in the afternoon sun. Simple things. The practical things a pilot remembers. The sky was full and then it was not. 3 years of preparation, reduced to that.